when you think that you lost. Oh, I will take your hand and we'll rise up from the dust. Oh, here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. When you feel it's hopeless, when you think that
Time to get started. I do need to clean my spectacles here first, but we'll get started right after that. Tonight is another relatively short chapter, and then we have one more chapter plus postscript and appendices, and they look like, just glancing at them, like they might be worth reading. So, but the last chapter is a pretty long one, so I might just break that up and do the last chapter Friday, and then next Tuesday do the postscript and appendices, because there seems to be a lot there. I don't know. I will look at it some more between now and then to decide, but see if decide if it's worth reading. They included it for a reason. So, all right, chapter 14 of the Hiram Key. The truth breaks free. The prophecy becomes truth. In our trawl through post-Jewish war literature, we came across a widespread belief known as Bereshit Rabbati, that the power of prophecy would return to Israel in AD 1210, and that soon after, the Messiah would appear out of hiding in the Great Sea of Rome, and it's S-E-E as in sea. Much to our surprise, this is arguably what appears to have happened. And it's there's a note about the Great Sea of Rome, Maimonides' letter to the Jews at Yemen. In 1244, just 34 years after the power of prophecy was to return to Israel, an infant was born to a family of minor nobles in eastern France. His name was Jacques de Molay. The young knight had a clear sense of mission, and he joined the Knights Templar at the earliest possible age, 21. He did well and developed a reputation for organization underpinned by rigorous discipline, and rose to be Master of the Temple in England before being made Grand Marshal with responsibility for military leadership of the order. When Tybald Gaudin, the Grand Master of the Templars, died in 1292, few people can have been surprised when Jacques de Molay was elected to this, the highest office. By this time, the Templars had lost control of the Holy Land. The Muslim Mamluks had taken Acre the previous year, thereby more or less bringing the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem to an end. However, Molay was still an immensely powerful man, controlling a huge number of estates across Europe as well as a fine army, a substantial battle fleet, and an international trading and banking syndicate. From humble beginnings 174 years earlier, when Hugh de Payan and his small band of knights started digging in the ruins of the temple, the order had become arguably the most powerful force in Christendom, rivaling or surpassing the Vatican itself. We strongly suspect that the early Templars did succeed in finding the gold, silver, and other treasures buried by the Jews as the Romans swept forward in the war of AD 66 through 70. As the speed of development of their wealth and influence seems too remarkable to be simple result of organic growth, it stands to reason that if they did find such treasures, they would have told nobody, and history could have no record of it. As soon as Molay came to power, he reimposed the full observance of all rules and maintained absolute discipline throughout the order. A total illiterate himself, he forbade other knights from wasting their time by reading, preferring to leave such tasks to the clerics. The Templars reported to the Pope directly, but they were a French-speaking order with most of their connections in that country. At the time, France had a particularly self-important and ambitious king in Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, who sought to manipulate the Pope to his own ends. But Boniface VIII was not an easy man to push around. They fell out when the Pope refused to allow Philip to levy taxes against the French Church, and in 1302 Boniface declared that, quote, the spiritual was greater than the temporal, and that to oppose the Pope was to oppose God, end quote. Philip announced to the world that Boniface was unfit to sit upon the throne of Peter, quote unquote, accusing the pontiff of every crime imaginable, including blasphemy, heresy, murder, and even sodomy. His desire to damn the Pope knew no bounds, and he tested the extremes of medieval credulity when he leveled the charge that Boniface had had a secret sexual relationship with a demon who lived in the Pope's ring. Not surprisingly, the Pope was angered and responded by imposing the highest level of excommunication on Philip personally, rather than on his kingdom. However, the king managed to gain substantial support throughout France, and Boniface responded by threatening to proclaim that the country was to be placed in the state of interdiction, which, whilst less terrible than national excommunication, was still an extremely bad state of affairs. For as long as an interdiction was in place, the people of France would not be baptized, attend communion, receive absolution, or even be buried with full Christian rites. Philip knew that such a sanction would bring him down, and he sent his henchmen to, quote, make the Pope an offer he could not refuse, end quote. On 8 September 1303, Guillaume de Nogaret, I know I butchered that, and his team entered the palace of Anagni in Italy, and seized the aged pope, abusing him and threatening him with great damage. Philip's men were unable to escape with the pope, and they knew that to kill him would be fatal for themselves, so they left uttering terrible threats. Boniface never recovered from the ordeal, and he died 5 weeks later. Some say at the hands of Philip because of the stress of the attack. The new pope, Benedict IX, started out with a friendly tone towards Philip, but as the French king started to increase his demands, the relationship quickly soured, to the point that the pope publicly accused Philip of ordering the attack on Boniface at Anagni. Soon Benedict was dead by poison at the hands of Philip the Fair. The king effectively chose his replacement, one Bernard de Goth, Archbishop of Bordeaux. He was a sworn but controllable enemy of the king, but his desire for the throne of Peter was far stronger than his dislike of Philip. Suddenly, in 1305, the megalomaniac King of France had control of the Vicar of Christ, and therefore Western Christendom. Barely solvent, Philip immediately levied a 10% tax on the gross revenue of the French clergy. 4 years later, the puppet pope effectively transferred the seat of power from the Vatican to Avignon, a situation that endured for the next 3/4 of a century. With the appointment of a controllable pope in Clement V, Philip the Fair now had the power he wanted, but now he needed money. Guillaume de Nogaret, still the king's henchman, was a very clever fellow, and he conducted an act of grand theft on the king's behalf, as cunning as it was wicked. After some extremely careful and skillful planning, the king's troops moved out in small groups right across the country on the morning of 22 July 1306 and arrested every Jew in the country. Shortly afterwards, the unfortunate Jews were sent into exile, naturally without their property, which was immediately transferred to the crown. It is little wonder, then, that this greedy king next turned his attention to the Templar master, Jacques de Molay, and all the wealth of the Paris Temple and its estates and business interests across the land. Nonetheless, even Philip could not expect to get away with open piracy towards an order of such high rank. The Knights Templar answered to no man save the Pope, and were outside the laws of every country. The king, however, was a resourceful man when it came to increasing his wealth and power, so he created the necessary circumstances for his plan to succeed without interference. The belief that the Templars indulged in some unusual rites had been suspected from the beginning of the order, but as the mightiest and most respected force in Christendom, they had been almost immune from serious speculation. Unfortunately, the very secrecy of their procedures provided an excellent reason for false charges to seem credible. A plan to destroy the Templars and seize their wealth was carefully put together by Guillaume de Nogaret. He must have had at least one spy planted within the Templar order, reporting back to him on the nature of the secret rituals of the Templars. Even so, this information alone would not have been sensational enough to bring down the world's most celebrated order, and to allow Philip to seize its wealth. So, to compensate for the absence of sufficiently damning evidence, de Nogaret simply arranged for the discovery, quote-unquote, of new information. False witnesses leaked the stories of foul deeds, and in due course King Philip felt obliged to inform the Pope of the grievous situation. The king knew that rivalry between the two most important orders of chivalry, the Templars and the Hospitallers, was deep and widespread, and he suggested to Pope Clement that he write to the Grand Master of both, inviting them to a meeting to discuss a plan for the support of the kings of Armenia and Cyprus. It was no secret that the Pope had ideas of merging the Knights of the Temple of Solomon and the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem into a single order to be called the Knights of Jerusalem, and de Molay almost certainly believed that this was the true agenda. Such a merger was out of the question for him, and he must have felt that even the wealth and power of the Templars, that given the wealth and power of the Templars, he could easily prevent such an unwanted marriage. On the other hand, in all likelihood, the Pope would probably have forced the merger. He had declared his preference for the Hospitallers to take the senior role. Meanwhile, King Philip had failed to convince anyone that his plan to make himself the leader of the joint order was the best solution. William de Villeret, the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, was unable to attend a meeting because he was fully occupied with an attack upon the Saracens of Rhodes. De Molay, who was in Limassol, Cyprus, when he received the papal order to travel to France for a meeting with the Pope, collected 60 knights together, packed 150,000 gold florins, and set sail for Marseille. De Molay had every right to expect a magnificent welcome from King Philip the Fair, as the Templars had rendered him many great services. They had loaned the king the money he required for the dowry of his daughter, the Princess Isabella, and the Paris Temple had provided a refuge for the king for several days when a public uprising got out of hand. On a personal level, the Grand Master must have felt that the king was a true friend who had asked de Molay to be the godfather of his son Robert. Suspecting that the Pope would raise the subject of a merger with the Hospitallers, de Molay had taken the precaution of having a document drafted that put the case for the continued independence of his order, entitled De Union Templi et Hospitalis Ordinum ad Clementem Papam Jacobi de Moleo Relentio. I know I butchered that. Sorry. The document was presented to the Pope at Poitiers. As soon as de Molay arrived in Paris, he was greeted with honors by the king, but the Grand Master soon became deeply worried when he started to hear about some rumors that were spreading about the misdeeds of the Templars. The secret plan drawn up by de Nogaret was to take the entire Templar force into custody simultaneously. Considering that there was some 15,000 Templars in France at the time, the task was a considerable one. But de Nogaret had excellent experience in undertaking mass simultaneous arrests from the previous year, when he had seized the entire Jewish community. The date of arrest for the Templars was set for Friday the 13th, October 1307. Sealed orders were sent out to the royal seneschals 3 weeks beforehand, with strict instructions that they must not be opened before Thursday the 12th of October. The orders started with a powerfully written, if somewhat lengthy, sentence designed to overcome any reluctance the seneschals may have had in carrying out the arrests of such famous knights. And here we have a quote of that first sentence. Quote, "A bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing horrible to think of, and terrible to hear, a detestable crime, an execrable evil deed, an abominable work, a detestable disgrace, a thing wholly inhuman, foreign to all humanity, has, thanks to the reports of several persons worthy of faith, reached our ears, not without striking us with great astonishment, and causing us to tremble with violent horror, and as we consider its gravity, an immense pain rises in us, all the more cruelly because there is no doubt that the enormity of the crime overflows to the point of being an offense to the divine majesty, a shame for humanity, a pernicious example of evil, and a universal scandal." End quote. That's one sentence. That would be unheard of nowadays. That's why some of the old documents, not this, but things written in the 19th century, for example, are very hard to read nowadays, because that's the kind of sentences you get. You forget what they were talking about by the time you get done with it. Okay. The main charges made from the testimony of an ex-Templar, Squin de Flexion, were, quote, "All Templars upon admission swore never to leave the order and to further its interest by any means, right or wrong; that the leaders of the order are in secret alliance with the Saracens, and they have more of Mohammedan infidelity than Christian faith, every novice being required to spit and trample upon the cross. The leaders of the order are heretical, cruel, and sacrilegious men, who kill or imprison any novice who, upon discovering the iniquity of the order, tries to leave it. That furthermore they teach women who are pregnant by them how to procure an abortion, and secretly murder newborn children. That they are infected with the errors of the Fraticelli. They despise the Pope, and the authority of the Church and scorn the sacraments, especially those of penance and confession, that they are addicted to the most infamous excesses of debauchery. If anyone expresses his repugnance, he is punished by perpetual captivity. That Templar houses are receptacles of every crime and abomination that can be committed. That the order works to put the Holy Land into the hands of the Saracens. That the master is installed in secret, and few of the younger brethren are present, and that he repudiates his Christian faith by doing something contrary to right. That many statutes of the order are unlawful, profane of the order are unlawful, profane, and contrary to Christianity, the members being forbidden under pain of perpetual confinement to reveal them to anyone. That no vice or crime committed for the honor or benefit of the order is held to be a sin. End quote. The arrest of some 15,000 Templars, including de Molay, was completed within the morning of Friday the 13th. The principal false witness was de Flexion, who had been expelled on the grounds of heresy and other offenses. Together with a Florentine called Nofodé, he gave evidence against the order in return for a pardon and release from prison. The Inquisition was given orders to extract confessions and that no torture should be spared in the furtherance of this objective. These skilled torturers were generally expert at inflicting maximum pain without actually killing their subject. Only 36 Templars died in the Paris area during the early stages of questioning. With the huge influx of prisoners, the Inquisition had to make special arrangements as there were insufficient dungeons and instruments of torture to go around. They were highly imaginative men, and they quickly came up with lots of inventive ideas for extracting confessions. A good example of this was the foot oven, which simply required a platform to strap the subject to, a little oil for their feet, and a brazier. This easy-to-make device proved to be highly effective at convincing Templars to tell the Inquisition the quote-unquote truth. One man was carried into court to confess holding a box in his hands which contained the blackened bones that had dropped out of his feet as they roasted. Despite the best efforts of the Inquisition, the confessions were slow in coming in, but enough were quickly available to horrify the public when they were told that the once preeminent Templars admitted that they had denied God, Christ, and the Virgin Mary, and that during their initiation they had bestowed the osculum infame, the kiss of shame, which involved kissing the initiator on the mouth, navel, penis, and buttocks. With the benefit of current knowledge, it is easy to dismiss these trumped-up charges as the output of the imagination of the accusers, but some of the confessions which emerged have to be taken much more seriously. Many countries were very slow in persecuting the Templars, despite orders from the Pope to have all members of the order arrested and questioned. Portugal, Ireland, Scotland, and England were amongst those that were not happy to carry out this instruction. In England, King Edward II eventually agreed to meet the papal command, but his torturers were not very successful, and the Paris Inquisition offered to help them and put men on the job who had more highly developed skills and a relish for their chosen trade. In June of 1311, the English Inquisition came across some very interesting information from a Templar by the name of Stephen de Strapelbrugge, who admitted that he was told in his initiation that Jesus was a man and not a god. Another Templar by the name of John de Stoke stated that Jacques de Molay had instructed that he should know that Jesus was but a man, and that he should believe in the great omnipotent God who was the architect of heaven and earth, and not the crucifixion. This has surprised a number of experts, because the statement does not fit any theological belief of the time, including that of heretical sects such as the Cathars, who probably did have contact with the order. Of course, it caused us no surprise whatsoever, as the words are exactly what we would expect of a man who has been initiated into a latter-day order of Nazarenes on the basis of the messages from the Jerusalem Church of James found in the Temple Scrolls. The view expressed by the Grand Master comes from the true teachings of Jesus and predates the crucifixion cult of Paul that had been adopted by the Romans. These views attributed to the Grand Master ring true. They do not reject Jesus, they merely remind people that there is only one God, one supreme being. It seems certain that such thoughts could only have come directly from James's church, where the teachings of Jesus were revered, but where the crucifixion was considered to be a powerful symbol of faithfulness unto death, in the mold of Hiram Key. Nothing more. The cross for the Templars was a mark of martyrdom rather than the source of magic that the crucifixion cult of Paul believed it to be. For all the information that we have gathered in our researches, we strongly feel that while the highest ranking knights may have had radically atypical views on the divinity of Jesus Christ, the Templars were, throughout their entire existence, a faithful Catholic order. In the mid-13th century, their wealth, possessions, armed might, and remoteness from Rome would have allowed them to have established a new type of Christianity if that had been their wish. They were clearly content holding their special knowledge to themselves and conducting their own secret ceremonies, which, like modern Freemasons, they considered to be complementary to their Christian faith. The Knights Templar were betrayed by a church and a pope that they had served well. The crucifixion. Excuse me. Okay, let's try that again. The crucifixion. That Jacques de Molay was horribly tortured, there is doubt, because this powerful warrior broke down and confessed to crimes he did not commit, although he did retract them shortly before being burned at the stake 7 years later. The means of persuasion were not recorded by the Inquisition, but strangely enough, we were to find evidence in the Scottish Templar building which would help us find out what really happened. We believe that we can reconstruct what happened to the Grand Master in those dungeons 7 centuries ago, thanks to one remarkable piece of evidence. What happened on Friday the 13th of October and Saturday the 14th of October 1307 must have been something like this. The Grand Inquisitor of France, Guillaume Imbert, had taken a personal interest in the confession to be extracted from the greatest heretic of them all, Jacques de Molay. As a priest torturing a priest, Imbert would normally have avoided the spilling of blood. Burning, crushing, and stretching, imaginatively applied, were usually highly effective alternatives. In this instance, though, Imbert must have been outraged by the evil Antichrist activities of this once senior man of God. One can imagine him visiting the Paris temple with the arresting officers and taking immediate control of the Grand Master. He wanders around the splendid building looking for evidence of wrongdoing to confront the accused, and upstairs he finds a large door with a brass plate at its center, and pushing it open he sees nothing but darkness. In the windowless inner temple he lights one of the large candles that stood at the first pedestal, and his eyes slowly scanned the strange sights that could be picked out in the dim flickering light. It was all so terribly pagan, with markedly anti-Christian ornamentation, pyramids with eyes in their center, a star-studded roof, and the square compasses. Amazed and unnerved by the ungodly feel of the place, he is suddenly certain that the stories are all true, and his prisoner must be the most evil heretic ever to walk the earth. Proceeding to the eastern end, he pauses in front of 2 large pillars and a main pedestal, looking down, and looking down he sees a simple wooden box which he finds contains a white shroud some 14 feet long, a human skull, and 2 thigh bones. This, he reasons, must be the shroud that he has heard tell from his spies was used to resurrect, quote unquote, the dead. The Grand Inquisitor is horrified that it is clearly true that de Molay has indeed mocked the suffering and holiness of the Passion of Jesus Christ by performing resurrection ceremonies with Templar initiates. A novel line of questioning occurred to Imbert right there and then, one particularly suited to the vile impudence of this fallen priest. That night, in the cells beneath the Paris Temple, with Dumoulin stripped of his mantle and naked beneath the rough smock of an accused heretic, complete with running noose around his neck, Imbert informs Dumoulin that he will admit to his crimes in due course, so why not save himself some pain and make a full confession? Much to the relief of the outraged Imbert, the Grand Master refuses. Imbert starts to quote from the Gospels. Quote, "Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him." End quote. Dumoulin's arms are pinioned high on the wall and the rough smock thrown forward over his head. His naked back is scourged by two assistants using horsewhips tipped with twin metal balls. The torturer on the right, being taller and keener than his partner, causes injury to the legs as well as the back, but not the upper arms. Quote, "And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head." End quote. A crown of intertwined thorns has been prepared and is thrust squarely onto Dumoulin's head, drawing blood from the scalp and forehead. Quote, "But they cried, saying, 'Crucify him, crucify him.'" End quote. And then the Grand Master is affixed to a roughly assembled cross. Square section nails are driven through the wrists. The violence of the nails' impact on the internal structure of Dumoulin's right hand causes his thumb to swing across the palm so violently that the joint dislocates, and his thumb nail embeds itself into the flesh of his palm. The sole of his left foot is pressed against the upright of the cross, known as the stipes, and a lengthy nail smashed through exactly in between the second and third metatarsals. As soon as the nail appears at the other side of the foot, the torturer places his left foot upon the right so that the same nail can be driven through both feet. Thus Dumoulin's body is suspended on just 3 points of searing pain. Blood loss is minimal and he remains fully conscious. Millet finds the pain indescribable as his body weight instantly works against him, causing him to sag downwards, producing traumatic tension in the muscles of his arms, shoulders, and chest wall. The rib cage is drawn upwards so that his chest is held in a position preventing exhalation, and in order to avoid asphyxiation, the Grand Master has no alternative but to push down on the wounds of his nailed feet to raise his body so that his lungs could blow out and gasp in one more chestful of air. The panic of not breathing is exchanged momentarily for the massive pain of standing upon impaled flesh. The overall effect of this repeated vile dilemma is increased anoxia, shortage of oxygen, leading to agonizing cramps and a dramatically raised metabolic rate. In between questioning, Imbert follows his biblical role model and offers Dumoulin a rag soaked in vinegar to quench his terrible thirst, again quoting the scriptures. Quote, "And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar and put it on a reed, and giving him to drink, saying, 'Let us see whether Elias will come to take him down.'" End quote. The hours seem like weeks, and Dumoulin's resistance begins to fail him. He asks Imbert what he needs to say to be brought down from the cross. Imbert quotes once more, quote, "But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water." End quote. Imbert thrusts a knife into Mollet's side, not deep enough to cause life-threatening damage, but sufficient to complete the deliberate reenactment of the suffering of the Son of God. Jacques de Molay confesses there and then on the cross, suffering the same vile agony that caused Jesus to lose his faith momentarily some 1280 years earlier. He is lifted down. The massive trauma to Dumoulin's body has caused the production of large amounts of lactic acid in his bloodstream, leading to what is called metabolic acidosis. His muscles have become frozen in permanent cramp. Blood pressure has plummeted and his heart is pounding. He is lifted down just moments away from the sweet relief of death. Guillaume Imbert is well pleased with his success and sees one more amusing twist. He has Dumoulin placed on the very burial shroud that Molay used to mock the Messiah, as the torturers laid him face upwards on the cloth, and the excess section is lifted over his head to cover the front of his body. Imbert cannot resist a final quotation from the story of the Passion. Quote, "And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth." End quote. Patting the shroud around this desperately damaged body, Imbert suggests that the barely conscious man might care to raise himself if he feels as important as the true Christ. Okay, it's one way it could have gone down. Hello, how are you tonight? Is that Lane? Am I reading that right? Lane 0503? Thank you for coming in. The Inquisition was under strict orders not to kill the Grand Master of the Templars, but had no intention of nursing the confessed heretic back to good health. De Molay had no family in the area to look after him, but Geoffrey de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, who was also under interrogation, did. De Charnay's family was called in and told to care for both men, who were destined to die together 7 years later, when they both publicly retracted their confessions and were slowly roasted over charcoal for their relapse into heresy, quote unquote. The physical evidence. We were able to reconstruct the circumstances of the interrogation of de Molay because one important piece of evidence still survives to this day. The Qumranian/Masonic style shroud that was taken from the Paris temple of the Knights Templar and used to wrap the damaged figure of the Grand Master traveled with de Molay to the home of Geoffrey de Charnay, where it was washed, folded up, and placed in a drawer. Exactly 50 years later, in 1357, this 14-foot-long piece of linen was taken out of store and put on public display at Livet. We cannot be sure as to whether or not it was exhibited because it was its half-centenary, but we can be certain as to why it was of public interest. De Molay's steaming body had been lifted down from the cross and left in a cold, damp underground dungeon where the injured man's morbid fluids, sweat mingled with blood high in lactic acid, had run freely around his body, staining the cloth where contact was firmest. The trauma of the crucifixion caused Jacques de Molay's body to paint the image of his suffering onto his own Masonic shroud. The de Charnay family had removed the shroud and dressed the wounds, and must have spent many months bringing de Molay back to something approaching reasonable health. The shroud itself was put away in the family home without further thought. Geoffrey de Charnay's nephew, also called Geoffrey, had been killed by the English in 1356, the year before the exhibition of the shroud, at the Battle of Poitiers, and it seemed likely that knowledge of the true origin of the shroud died with him. The image on the shroud was remarkably clear. The features of de Molay's body were etched onto the cloth by the lactic acid from the free-flowing blood, reacting with the frankincense used as a whitening agent, which was rich in calcium carbonate. The long nose, the hair beyond shoulder length with a center parting, the full beard that forked at its base, and the fit-looking 6-foot frame all perfectly match the known image of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. See figures 19 and 20, which we are going to go back and look at towards the end of the book. Hey, Vesper! How you doing? Welcome in. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing tonight, Vesper? I hope you're well. Okay. Okay. The first people to view the shroud thought that they recognized the image because it fitted their notion of a man that had suffered a similar fate just over 1,300 years earlier. They thought that they were looking at the face of Jesus, and that length of cloth is today called the Shroud of Turin. I knew that was coming. I am doing good. We're getting close to the end of the book, so I'm feeling good. I've been enjoying it, but I'm ready to be done with it so that I can move on to the next one. I have an interesting book picked out for the next one, so um, I think I'm going to read something about Agartha, which would, if people are not familiar with Agartha, it is has some to do. Um, I don't know how much because I haven't read about it yet. With the idea of the hollow earth. So that should be a fun read. Take it with a grain of salt. Take it with a whole truckload of salt, however you feel about it. Anyway, moving on. The image that the Christian world has learned to love as the face of God is in fact the face of a man tortured and murdered in God's name, not by the Romans, but by a money-grabbing French king with the support of the Roman Catholic Church. Many people have searched for the origins of the Turin Shroud. We believe that we have found the solution because we did not look for it. All of the various theories previously put forward previously deny some aspect of the available evidence, but in our quest to find Hiram, the shroud was just a passing jigsaw piece that helped complete a total picture. In 1988, the Vatican allowed scientific tests to be carried out at 3 separate carbon dating establishments. These showed conclusively that the linen of the shroud could not date any earlier than AD 1260. Given that the shroud had probably been in use for a few years, that puts it right on target. Very strangely, the findings of the carbon daters were published on 13 October, the same day of the year that Dumoulin had been arrested and crucified. There is a 1 in 365 chance of this being a coincidence that we could not help wondering if but we could not help wondering if there was more to it than that. The Vatican has always denied that the shroud is a holy relic because the Church knows its origin. Could it be that Rome thought it fitting to prove the point on the very anniversary of the shroud's creation? The teachings of Jesus effectively died with him, to be replaced by Hellenistic mystery formulae created by Paul, the spouter of lies. Yet the resurrected teachings were released to the world once again by the crucifixion of Jacques de Molay. For the 1,274 years between the two identical crucifixions, the true teachings of Jesus lay, quote unquote, dead and buried under the temple in Jerusalem. But once released to the world, the concepts of equality, social responsibility, and the power of human knowledge reemerged to end the intellectual vacuum of the well-named Dark Ages. The political power that the Roman Empire had been losing in the first 3 centuries AD was maintained through the planning of Constantine, who, as we showed earlier, had a complex web of superstition woven to wrap up the minds of the masses to keep them in their place. His vision for the common people was to use them to produce goods and wealth in peacetime and provide soldiery in time of war. Their reward for their sad, ignorant little lives was the promise of their own personal resurrection and a wonderful afterlife. The Church of Rome positioned blind faith as a virtue and labeled Christian literature referring to knowledge for the individual as Gnostic, and this they called evil. Gnostic is simply from the Greek for knowledge. It is no coincidence that the period popularly referred to as the Dark Ages corresponds with time between the rise of the Roman Church and the crucifixion of Jacques de Molay. Thankfully, due to the true teachings of Jesus, the age of darkness that had lasted 1,250 years started to back away from the shining light of reason. The message breaks out. Yeah, I'll take it with a whole salt mine. Haha. Yeah, exactly. I'm not taking it seriously, but I want to read about it just because why not? That's what this stream is about. So Yeah, we're going to read something about Hollow Earth next, and then we're going back to Plato. We're going to read the Republic. But first, some goofiness, and then we'll get back into the serious stuff. Okay, so we're coming up. We've got a few more pages left in this chapter. The message breaks out. Whilst the Grand Master was being crucified, many Templars had slipped the net. A large part of the Templar fleet had been in harbor at the Atlantic seaport of La Rochelle, and they must have been tipped off or picked up some rumors, for as the sun rose on the morning of Friday the 13th of October, the would-be arresting guards could see only water where the fleet had been tied up the night before. The ships of the order were never seen again, but their battle flag, the skull and crossbones, was. We now needed to establish what happened to those Templars that managed to escape the clutches of King Philip. From our investigations, we found that their presence can be detected in two places soon after the escape: Scotland and America. We cannot be sure from the surviving evidence, but stories persist of Templar ships going to Scotland and to Portugal. The fleet could have visited both refuges in turn, but it seems more probable to us that they divided as soon as they left port, with one section headed towards Scotland and the remainder sailing to the northern tip of friendly Portugal to stock up with provisions. From there they set out on a voyage that had often been discussed, but, due to commitments in the Holy Land, had never been undertaken. They pointed their bows exactly due west and set sail on what is now the 42nd parallel in search of the land marked by the star they knew from the Nazarene scrolls was called Merica, which these French knights referred to as l'America, a name that later became simply America. They almost certainly landed in the Cape Cod or Rhode Island area of New England in the early weeks of 1308, setting foot on the New World nearly a century and a half before Christopher Columbus was even born. This is a strong claim, but irrefutable evidence is already in existence to show that the Templars did reach America, settled there, and that they carried out journeys to and from Scotland. In the small town of Westford, Massachusetts, there is an image of a knight carved as a series of punched holes into a slab of rock. The now famous knight can be seen to be wearing a helmet and the habit of a military order and the sword shown in the weathered carving that has been identified as having a pommeled hilt of the style of a European knight of the 14th century. But for us, the most fascinating feature is the shield, which has a clear and simple design upon it. It depicts a single-masted medieval vessel sailing west toward a star. Okay, I'm going to try to show you this. It's a small illustration, but it's an interesting one, so we'll see how this works. We'll get right up there close to it. So you can actually make out the... come on, focus. It's not focusing. You can actually make out the star. I can't really tell if that is a ship, but okay, I can see the star. I see the helmet and the sword. Anyway, I might have to look that one up to see it online, see a better picture of it. Maybe an actual photo. At Newport, Rhode Island, there is a second European monument, a puzzling tower constructed in the style of Templar round churches. It has been described as having typically Romanesque architectural details in its pillars and arches. Its dating puts this strange tower right into the century that saw the Templar fleet disappear. It was probably a multi-purpose building for the new colonists, serving as a church, a watchtower, and a lighthouse. There is no doubt that the building is extremely old, because on a map of 1524 recording the European discovery of this coastline, Italian navigator Giovanni de Verrazzano marked the location of the Newport Tower as an existing Norman villa. These finds are very powerful indicators of a Templar presence in the New World, but alone they are not conclusive. However, we already knew that Rosslyn Chapel provides the evidence that is beyond debate. As we discussed earlier in this book, well known as a place where the Templars congregated after the attack by King Philip and the Pope, this elaborate building took some 40 years to build and was completed in the early 1480s by Oliver St. Clair, which predates Christopher Columbus's arrival in America by several years. Columbus made his first New World landing on the morning of 12 October 1492 on an island in the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. His first mainland landing was not made until 1st August 1498 when he arrived in South America. When considering these comparative dates, it is extremely instructive to look at the carved decoration of the chapel because there the apparently impossible is evident. As stated earlier, the archways and ceiling of Rosslyn Chapel have corn cobs, Indian maize, and aloes carved into them as decorative devices. These are two plants that the Scots had no right to know about, let alone illustrate so accurately. Cord was extensively cultivated in all its present forms by the Indians of North and South America, but it is still believed to have been unknown outside the New World before 1492 at the very earliest. According to official history, seed grains of Indian maize were first brought to Europe and Africa by 16th century explorers and eventually thrived throughout most of the world. These carved plants are very much an integral part of the fabric of the chapel, and they must have been started some years before the completion of the building. So we have certain evidence that the men that instructed the masons of Rosslyn Chapel must have visited America at least a quarter of a century before Columbus. In the light of such solid evidence, we can accept the Westward Knight and the Newport Tower for what they are, Templar remains in what is today the United States of America. The land of the star called La America. Before leaving the subject of the first European landings in the New World, we would like to explain why it became our firm conviction that the continent of America took its name not from the also-ran explorer Amerigo Vespucci, but from the star of the west called Merica, which the Nazareans believed was the marker of a perfect land across the ocean of the setting sun. Not only did we have the evidence of the true source of the name, we found that the old explanation is easy to disprove. The standard historical line that is routinely trotted out for the origin of the name of the New World comes entirely from a silly misunderstanding by an obscure clergyman who never ventured more than a few miles from the monastery of Saint Deodatus in the Vosges Mountains in the Duchy of Lorraine on the French-German border. This very enthusiastic priest had a passion for geography and for deeply meaningful names. He gave himself the highly imaginative pseudonym of Hylacomelus, from the Greek for wood, the Latin for lake, and the Greek for mill, which was eventually translated back to his native German to create the family name of Waldseemüller. This slightly eccentric man led a small team who had access to a printing press, and they gathered what information they could about the world, including the inspiring discoveries of the great and mysterious continent across the Western Ocean. The little group produced the printed 103-page volume in April 1507 that they called Cosmographia Introductio. Cosmographiae Inductio. Yeah, okay. It covered the traditional principles of cosmography, including the division of the planet, distances between key locations, and details of wind and climates. But it was also the source of a mistake that would make an amateur navigator famous for all time. Waldseemüller had found a number of references by various sailors to the general landmass of the great continent to the west, describing it as America. And he also found a glowing account of the travels of an Italian explorer by the name of Amerigo Vespucci. He erroneously married the two pieces of unconnected information and wrote, quote, now these parts of the earth, Europe, Africa, Asia, have been more extensively explored, and a fourth part has been discovered by Amerigo Vespucci, as will be described in what follows. Insomuch as both Europe and Asia received their names from women, I see no reason why anyone should justly object to calling this part Amerige, from the Greek ge meaning land of, i.e., the land of Amerigo, or America, after Amerigo, its discoverer, a man of great ability. End quote. Waldseemüller printed his book with a giant map with the new continent marked as America, and it has always been assumed that he was the originator because it was the first printed reference. The words of the monk given here have been taken as showing his thinking process on what form of Amerigo Vespucci's name to use, but it is not that at all. Read it carefully, and it can be seen that it shows nothing more than that he was musing over why the existing name America is so appropriate. It was a name that, in his opinion, could have been perhaps better as Amerige, but he could quite understand why America was an acceptably meaningful construction. This book was written 15 years after the official Columbus discovery of the New World, and exactly 200 years after the Templars first landed there. In either case, it seems silly to assume that nobody had given this continent a name before this German monk started writing a book called Introduction to Cosmography, or that such a non-sailor would have had the audacity to assume that he had the right to christen a new quadrant of the globe. Waldseemüller got the name right but the explanation wrong. His personal inclination for meaningful names misled him, and the power of the printing press ensured that his error was transmitted widely in a very short space of time. Very shortly after he had written these words, he realized his great mistake and publicly retracted his assertion that Amerigo Vespucci was the discoverer of the New World. But by then it was too late. People had an explanation that seemed to make some sort of sense. It was a classic case of history, to paraphrase Henry Ford, becoming bunk. Once a convention is accepted, it takes intellectual dynamite to shift it. The accidental myth of Vespucci is cultural folklore in the American education system, but those that really want to understand America and the forces that created the modern United States need to follow the evolutionary chain of Nazarian thinking. And then we have our conclusion for this chapter. The downfall of the Knights Templar was the end of a great order, but its demise opened up the way for a whole new world order based upon Jesus' reworking of Ma'at. In reconstructing the crucifixion of Jacques de Molay and tracking the flight of his knights, we felt close to finding the final link with Freemasonry, why the Templars had provided their secrets to form a new order called Freemasonry was still not clear, but at least we knew where to look for some answers to these gaps in our knowledge. As we reviewed what we had discovered about the events surrounding the crucifixion of Jacques de Molay, we could not help but see it as the central event in an episode of history that marked out the greatest ever watershed in the course of Western social development. The attack on the Templar order by a greedy and unimportant French king proved to be the first vital step in the long process of releasing the Christian world from the prevailing principle of intellectual castration exercised by the Vatican and allowing it to build a civilization driven by a desire for knowledge and recognition of the worth of the individual. This drive from autocracy to democracy in government and the aristocracy to meritocracy in social structure within a framework of theological tolerance has nowhere been so conspicuously sought and in part achieved than in the United States of America. The end of the chapter. So, as I said at the beginning, that leaves us with one long chapter plus the postscript and some appendices that I'm going to decide whether or not it's worth reading. Probably I will, because next reading I'll read the last long chapter, and then then the next one I'll read the postscript and appendices, which are shorter, and I'll show all of the pictures, lots of pictures, um, some interesting ones of all the stuff they've talked about in the book, including Rosalind Chapel and such. So that's the plan. So 2 more readings and we'll be done with this book. And then we'll start into the Hollow Earth book. So, all right. Who be around to raid? Well, we got Mr. Blitzer playing Outriders. Yeah, let's go ahead and go on over there. So if you'll bear with me a few minutes, give him a minute of your time. Say hello if you feel that you'd like to, and I will take us on over there. See you there in a minute.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations.